Hi friends, it's time for my annual end of the year stats video where I just tell you a bunch of nerdy bookish things. So in total this year I read 134 books, which is pretty good. It's the lowest I've read in the last 4 years, but considering what was happening in my life this year, like, I'm pretty impressed with myself. I had set my Goodreads goal to 72 books, I think, so I almost doubled my goal. So with reading 134 books, that math works out to reading a book every 2.7 days. So I read a book every 2 to 3 days this year. And now I'll show you all of them. So here is a stack of them. This is all the books. Some of them I don't have physical copies of because maybe I borrowed them from the library, or I read the ebook or listened to the audiobook, so I just kind of flipped around some books and wrote a fake title on so you know what they represent. Then I'll show you this view, which is really fun. It's organized kind of by color, like in color groups, and I was really surprised with how many purple and pink books I read this year. I was also surprised with how many faces are on the covers of the books I read this year. Lots of faces. Another view is my bullet journal, which is fun because you can see the stacks as I color them in every single month from January to December. And the last view, I'll show you it by month. So how many books I read in any given month from January to December. So as you can see by that view, my best reading months were October and November, where I read like 16 to 18 books. And my worst month was December, which was only 4 books. Although if you want to really say my best reading month, that wouldn't be the month that I read the most books, it would be the month that I read the most 5 stars, which would be July. In July, I read 8 5-star books. This year in total, I read almost 30 5-star books, but we'll get to the star ratings at the end. So 134 books, that amounts to 42,577 pages, which is about 116 pages every day. My average book size was 317 pages, which seems accurate. Most of the books that I read are between 300 and 350 pages. The shortest book I read was I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya, coming in around 80 pages. And the longest book I read was The Outsider by Stephen King, coming in at about 550 pages. My average rating this year was 3.7, which is the exact same as last year and quite a bit higher than the 2 years previous, which is always good. Reading books that you like is good. Here's a stack of books that I read organized by authors who I was reading for the first time, and then authors that I've read from before. The stacks are pretty even, which makes me really happy because I'm reading stuff from authors that I know I love, and then I'm also delving into a lot of brand new authors, a lot of debut authors too. My newest favorite authors that I discovered this year and will be reading everything they probably ever write are Shobha Rao, Emily X.R. Pan, and Elizabeth Acevedo. And then from authors that I know and love, I have some favorites. So basically I have new favorite books by E.B. Zaboy. I have a new favorite Anna Marie McLemore. I have a new favorite Ruth Ware, and I have a new favorite Paul Tremblay. So I read a lot of authors that I've read before this year, but they were pretty much all standalones. In total, I only read 2 sequels this entire year. They're Beneath the Sugar Sky by Seanan McGuire and Force of Nature by Jane Harper. Here are the 134 books organized by kind of where they came from. So here's a stack of books that I already owned, so books I read this year that were pulled off of my TBR shelf. Next stack is books that I bought myself and read this year, and then books that I was sent and read this year. So those are the majority of books that I read. And then the last stack is books that basically I borrowed. So most of them I got from the library or had an audiobook or had an ebook. In total, I reread 7 books this year. I don't do a lot of rereads, but I took the opportunity during Lullathon to reread some of my favorite books. So that's all of my rereads of the year. Now let's take a look at genres, because this is always fun. So the first stack is kind of general fiction, mostly contemporary. And then I have a stack of specifically contemporary with a romance element being a main portion of the book. My biggest stack is mystery, thriller, horror. Then my stack of fantasy is pretty hefty as well. A lot of them aren't traditional high fantasy. A lot of them are kind of contemporary but have a fantasy element. So they all kind of felt like they would fit into this stack. I read a lot of short story collections, anthologies this year. Then I have a stack of sci-fi. I had to combine some stacks because I ran out of space. Here's my nonfiction. Here's my poetry. My most read genre this year was fiction, but within that it would be mystery, thriller, horror. A genre that I read more of this year than previous years, or I guess a subgenre, would definitely be retellings. I don't know what happened with me, but I read retellings of Swan Lake, Pride and Prejudice, Alice in Wonderland, Beowulf, The Little Mermaid, Moby Dick, and then a couple anthologies that had to do with folklore, mythology, and old stories. And a genre I read less of compared to usual, again, not technically a genre, but it's basically just books set in the past, whether it be historical fiction or classics. I can't think of very many I read at all this year that weren't set in present day or future. As far as where the books were set, I have this scratch off map, and I've been tracking all of the different books from different countries that I read this year. And in total this year I read books from 18 different countries or parts of the world. My goal was higher, but I'm going to continue to scratch off the map in future years, and my goal is essentially to read a book from every single country on the planet eventually at some point in my life. But this year I read books from Canada and the United States, Ireland, United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland, Greece, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Russia, China, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, Tasmania, Virgin Islands. Those are some places that I covered so far. The award for saddest book that I read this year was probably All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. This is the book that made me cry the most. The award for most fun book would go to Undead Girl Gang. Usually I do funniest, the book that made me laugh the most, but I can't think of any book this year that I read that put me in a genuine happy mood. I don't know what that says about me, but this was the funnest reading experience of the year. The book that felt like the biggest accomplishment this year was not my longest book, but it was one of the most hyped books from the book community, and that's The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. I did really enjoy this in the end, but I basically struggled for 11 months to even pick this up and find the motivation to read it. So it felt like an accomplishment when I finally read like what I consider the most hyped mystery of 2018. The weirdest book I read this year was The Echo Room by Parker Peavy House. This was a very ambitious book and unlike anything I've ever read before. The most surprising book of the year, not in plot but in my enjoyment of, is a tie between The Night Guest by Fiona McFarlane and 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl by Mona Awad. These were surprising to me just because they've been on my TBR shelf for years and I haven't heard great things about either of them, and I ended up giving both of them 5 stars. The most surprising as far as plot goes is going to be Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. This was definitely the most unexpected, shocking plot twist of the year. And for my most disappointing book of the year, I did an entire video on my least favorite books of the year, which is different. I actually have a little stack of those. So Save the Date by Morgan Matson. I think I'm done with Morgan Matson. In Her Skin by Kim Savage, who I previously loved. Didn't work for me. All of This Is True by Ligia de Pennaflor. I hyped this up so much in my mind. And then the most read book. So the most popular book that I read this entire year, the most that other people have also read it, is one of my biggest disappointments, and its daughter, Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This just was not for me. Another way I organized the stack was 2018 releases versus other years. So the majority of books that I read in any given year were published in that year, so this is not surprising. Speaking of books published this year, some books that didn't end up in my favorites video I would like to highlight. Mainly middle grade. I read some awesome middle grade this year. Actually, I read 3 middle grade this year, and they all turned out to be 5-star reads. However, a middle grade doesn't often impact me and impress me enough to end up on my favorites list, but I would still like to recommend them to you. Harbor Me by Jacqueline Woodson was incredible. Amal Unbound by Aisha Saeed. And one of my favorite books ever that I don't have yet is Hurricane Child by Karen Callender. Speaking of middle grade, here's the stacks organized by age range. So the books I read this year that were middle grade, I just told you all of them. And then young adult, and then adult. Speaking of adult, in my favorites video, 6 of my 10 favorites were young adult and only 4 ended up being adult. So again, I would like to highlight some honorable mentions. I read a lot of really great thrillers this year, but only one of them ended up in my favorites video. So I just wanted to run through my favorite thrillers of the year if you want some specific recommendations. I Know You Know by Jilly McMillan. Watching You by Lisa Jewell. Her Pretty Face by Robin Harding. The Wife Between Us by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pimbrough. The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware. And The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. And then my 2 favorite YA thrillers I read this year that didn't make the list are Sadie by Courtney Summers and All These Beautiful Strangers by Elizabeth Klefoff. Here's a stack of books I read again this year, organized this time by women authors that I read versus a stack of men, and then a stack of other, which is usually just anthologies written by more than one person. Speaking of anthologies, again, something that didn't make my favorites video. My favorite anthologies were All Out and Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time. And then I'll do a couple other honorable mentions that didn't make that favorites video. Make sure you go watch that favorites video if you haven't already. My favorite sci-fi of the year was Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl and The Final Six by Alexandra Monier. My favorite retellings of the year, again, that didn't make my favorites list, were Pride by E.B. Zaboy and A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney. My favorite romance of the year would be All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover and Listen to Your Heart by Casey West. My favorite fantasy that didn't quite make the list, The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson and Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. And I have 2 more favorite fantasies, but they also fall under LGBTQ, if you want to consider that a genre. So my favorite queer books that I read this year, Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno and Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. And finally, my star ratings. So here are my 1-star and 2 stars. Not huge stacks, which is always nice. My 3-star and 4-star are always the biggest stacks, which makes sense. And then I have a stack of 5-star books, which I think I've covered every single one of them in this video. So you don't need to zoom in and find out what they are. I mentioned all of them either here or in my favorites video, or they were rereads. So I've already told you all about them. If you want to see more of the books I read this year, I will go ahead and link down below my year in review on Goodreads, and you can scroll through every single book I read this year because I didn't get a chance to talk about a lot of the 3 and 4 stars. But if you want to see all the books and what I rated them, I will link that Goodreads. And those are all my reading stats for 2018. I'm really happy with everything I read. I read some of my all-time favorite books this year, which is always exciting. I would love to hear what your favorite books of the year were. If you've done any stats like this, you can talk about them in the comments below or link me to your blog or your video if you're a booktuber. I'd love to check out your end of the year stats because I'm a book nerd and it's great. And I will see you next year. Bye. So excited to finally be telling you my favorite books of 2018. I feel like I haven't really taken the opportunity to talk about these books very much at all besides in my monthly wrap-ups. I feel like you might be surprised by some books that are on this list